Now, we've seen progress today on the front of the Australian journalists who were assaulted outside of the White House in those protests when they turned quite violent. All of a sudden, the two police officers who did hit them have been stood down pending that investigation. Do you think the promptness of that response shows that there is still quite a strong diplomatic relationship between Australia and the United States?
No question. The U.S. Embassy in Canberra quickly released a statement regarding the freedom of the press. I think allies of Australia within the United States, which are many, quickly responded to make sure that this was handled quickly. The interesting thing for me about this was the two police officers who stood down were U.S. Park Police. And one of the issues we're seeing right now in Washington, D.C. is policemen from the Park Police, from Border Protection, from Correctional Services, all coming together, haven't trained together, don't have the necessary skill set for crowd control. And that's probably one of the problems we're seeing in the United States, the chaos that we've seen for the last week plus.
How significant do you think it is that the president has been suggesting that they do need to bring in military personnel into different states? We know some state governors have been saying that they don't need it, that they can manage the protests in their own way and worry it will contribute to escalating violence. And it does raise those issues about state sovereignty versus the federal government.
Absolutely, and more fundamentally, it raises questions about the role of the military in American society. Had this been happening in any other country around the world, the U.S. government, the U.S. State Department, would be criticizing this about an inappropriate role of the military in society. The fact that you had the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Secretary of Defense, and the Attorney General accompanying the president when he crossed the park and went and gave his now widely reported speech in front of St. John's Parish, it really spoke of a unprecedented involvement of the military in politics. You've had some pushback on that. This morning, Secretary Esper made it very clear that the military needed to remain apolitical, although there's questions about his own ability to do that. And we saw, in a remarkable turn of events, former Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis, highly respected general, come out and sharply criticize the president for the politicization of the military. So seems to be a real flashpoint in the debate in the United States right now.
And this really does raise a lot of questions about how the election is going to look this year when you've got everyone locked down at the moment. Despite these protests, most people are staying well away from public gatherings. And so there are questions about how people will head to the polling booth, and also really undermining a lot of the key arguments of Donald Trump up until this point. He can't say that the economy is doing well. That was one of his big selling points. But by the same token, Joe Biden really needs to step up his campaign at the same time.
I saw a remark earlier this morning that really struck home, that the United States in the last 5 months alone has experienced the impeachment of a president. For the first time, representing the impeachment of the president of 1974, the 1918 Spanish flu equivalent in COVID-19, the collapse of the U.S. economy and stock market reminiscent of 1929, and race riots and real division similar of 1968. And that's all happened in a short period of 5 months. So there's no question right now that the U.S. is going for an extremely difficult time. And that, as you rightly point out, sets the context for the choice that Americans will be facing on the election day this November. As of right now, the president's disapproval ratings are at record high, 54% in the most recent polls released today. And those same polls show Joe Biden as a candidate, leading him in the key swing states, and including states like Arizona. So it's going to be an interesting time, but there's still a long months until the election itself. And so given the pace of change in the United States, it bears close watching.
And what do you think is going to be the next step for the United States? These rallies seem to have calmed down a bit, that we don't see the violence and the looting happening tonight that we've seen in the other nights of this particular response in the United States. Do you think this will calm down, or should we be bracing for more protests?
So I would like to make a real clear distinction between the rallies and the protests and the looting and the violence. From the very beginning, those have been very different groups at play. Now, clearly, there has been anger in places like Minneapolis, but those aren't the same as the largely peaceful protests that have taken place, not just in the United States, but around the world and even here in Australia. You're absolutely correct. The situation has become more peaceful. I think there's been a public backlash against the violence and the looting, but a tremendous public upswing in support for the demonstrations. So much so that today, after 3 days of feeling quite alarmed at the situation in my homeland, today I was quite optimistic. The scenes, once again, in front of the White House, in front of St. John's Parish today couldn't be more different than they were just 2 days ago. Tens of thousands of protesters singing together, Lean on Me, assembled peacefully, waving candles, or the modern version of a candle, which is a cell phone light, really point to a tremendous level of public support for the United States to move forward on these incredibly divisive issues. We're just seeing right now the image of the helicopters on the exact same street corner trying to disperse people 2 days ago. This evening, they're back, and they're back peacefully singing, letting their voices be heard, and that gives me hope for the future of the United States.